talked about in the video on paraphrasing text evidence. Professional writers paraphrase far more often than they directly quote the text. However, directly quoting the text is something important that happens in certain circumstances when it really pays off to have the exact language of the original text right there in front of you. Sometimes, in the case of historical writing, this is when you're referring to a primary source. Sometimes it's when you want to catch the tone or the voice or the vibe or talk about the specific word choices that were made. Today, we're going to talk about those specific circumstances and when it makes sense to go the extra mile and directly quote the text. Today's move is deciding when to quote text evidence. So let's take a look at how some professional writers do this. The first circumstance under which you would want to directly quote the text evidence, and probably the one that makes the most sense and is the best use of this tool, is when you want to discuss the language itself. In this article from The Ringer, the writer is talking about the enduring power of Eminem's song, Lose Yourself. And he wants to talk about the way that Eminem plays with language. And so to do that, as you can see in this quote, he actually quotes the song. The italics you see are the writers. They're not in the original lyrics of the song, but he's doing this to highlight the language. And then there is discussion about what does that language show? Oh, well, it's the intercutting of two different vowel sounds together, which creates tension in the song, which is that discussion part of text evidence that we talked about. Because the writer wants to actually dive into the language of the original text itself, it makes sense to give time to quote it directly. It wouldn't be the same if he just paraphrased it or summarized it for us. Here's another example. Now, this is from the world of literary analysis. This is from a review of The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy, who is a writer known for his inventive and often strange use of language. And here we see that language really unpacked. It says the first paragraph of The Passenger works as a microcosm of the problem. It paints a barren scene, a snowy field in which a young woman has hanged herself. Here starts the quote. It had snowed lightly in the night, and her frozen hair was gold and crystalline, and her eyes were frozen and cold and hard as stones. Now, he doesn't just quote that to show us that it was a snowy night, right? He's already said that. He doesn't need a quote to prove that that's true. He's actually going to dig into the language. Before you've even settled in, McCarthy has thrown "and" at you 4 times, a word that both splits and fuses. You hear Hemingway and the curious loudness of those supposedly clipped and stripped down sentences, something attention-seeking in the syntax. Now, a second circumstance in which a writer would want to actually quote the text is when they want to capture the voice or the tone of the original source. Often this is when it's a primary source. Here in Scientific American, we have some scientific writing about climate change. And the writer Douglas Fox writes, in satellite images, the center of the ice shelf looks stable, but it isn't. Pettit says, there are 5 or 6 different ways this thing could fall apart. Now, again, of course, Fox could have chosen to paraphrase. He could have said, the scientist, Pettit, says that this is pretty bad, or says this is pretty fragile situation. But he wants to capture that voice, that kind of really ominous tone of there are 5 or 6 different ways that this thing could fall apart. So it's worth it in this case to give the time to actually directly quoting that evidence. Here's an example from literature. Edwards writes with flair, leaning into snappy dialogue, making it easy to speed past occasional potholes and pesky anachronisms. I've been a girl Friday for the best PI in the city for years, you moron, Viviana tells a cop who can't quite believe she's cracked the case. You think I didn't learn a thing or two? In this case, Sarah Weinman, the reviewer of this particular book, wants the reader to hear the voice of this character, Viviana. And so to do that, we really need to hear her. We need to hear a direct quote that shows that snappiness that covers up for a multitude of other sins in the plotting of the book. The last time that professional writers choose to directly quote rather than paraphrase is when the text just says it better than you can. The language is better, it's more direct, it's more concise, it's more powerful, and you just couldn't do it better yourself. This is an example of an article about the TV show Yellowstone. And they're talking again about the quality of the dialogue, the quality of the banter. And that would be really hard to paraphrase. You kind of just need to hear it for yourself. So the writer of this article lets us do this with that little snippet of dialogue that you see below. Instead of paraphrasing that and just saying, this character has a lot of zingers, she has some really good one-liners, which wouldn't give us the exact flavor, wouldn't say it as well as letting us hear it directly from the character herself. And one last example of saying it better than you can. We have here a piece from Smithsonian Magazine. It's a historical piece about a father and daughter who worked in labor together side by side to change labor laws. And they're talking about this boss who liked to make these big speeches. He was really well known for it. And you can see it says he also stood out for his height, 6'3", his lean frame, his shabby clothing, and his deep rumbling voice, which made his speeches sound, the Chicago Tribune said, like an eloquent graveyard. This is another example of directly quoting a primary source, right? A source that actually heard this man give his speeches. And instead of saying he had a really somber voice, but actually it was also very elevated and elegant, right? The Chicago Tribune kind of nailed it, an eloquent graveyard. Gosh, that's interesting language and says it a lot better probably than John Greenspan could summarize it in his own paraphrase. So we have three circumstances in which you would want to go ahead and directly quote. But I want to give you a couple of other tips before we go. When we do this, you will see that writers use the smallest applicable quote from the text possible. Often you and I, when we're starting out as writers, use big chunks of text because we want to prove that we have all this text evidence in there. But writers typically don't do that. You'll see here in this review by Stephen King, why are Mr. Gardner's library shelves so empty? Because students must not have access to books that, quote, might expose them to dangerous ideas, unquote. In our video on incorporating text evidence, we talked about how it's really sophisticated to weave together little bits of text evidence with our own language, as we see Stephen King doing here. But on the whole, you don't want those big chunks. You want the smallest bit of the quote that actually shows the thing you're trying to show. And we weave direct quotes into our paraphrase. Here is another book review. This one's from Maureen Corrigan at NPR. And you'll notice a number of quotes just kind of woven in and out with her paraphrase of the book. Let's look at it. Thomas Hutchinson, a royal governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, damned Samuel Adams as the chief incendiary of the revolutionary passions that ignited in Boston. Contemporaries credited Samuel Adams with being the prime mover of the Boston Tea Party. Thomas Jefferson called Adams the patriarch of liberty. In there we have three different quotes from different pieces of text evidence, but we don't have this big blocky text, right? She's paraphrasing what other people said about Samuel Adams, and then just weaving in those smallest applicable bits of quotes that will really bring it to life because it says it better than she could even say it herself. So where in your writing is it worth the effort to directly quote? Where do you want to show a particular voice or a particular tone? Where does the writer say it better than you could say it yourself? Where does it make sense that we really need to hear from the text itself and not someone else's summary of it? Where do you need to cut a quote down so that you're using the smallest applicable bit of that direct quote instead of using a gigantic chunk? Where could you weave together your paraphrase with direct quote evidence? I'm so glad you were here. Thanks for watching, and please make sure that you're liking and subscribing so that you don't miss any future mini moves for writers.